Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. My guest today, returning after multiple appearances, is Anthony Esolen. Anthony is the author or translator of 25 books now. He's a professor at Magdalen College of the Liberal Arts. His most recent book is No Apologies: Why Civilization Depends on the Strength of Men. But actually today we're going to be discussing his previous book from last year, which is In the Beginning Was the Word, an annotated reading of the Prologue of John. So we're going to be discussing what makes John's Gospel unique, what makes it the most sublime piece of literature ever produced, I suppose, and the Poetics of John. Tony, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me back. It's great to be here.
Before we start talking about this book, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about this very, very new project that you've just started, which is a Substack page.
Right. It's called Word and Song, and every week, there'll be 4 entries every week. You get them through emails, right? That's the typical Substack way. They are forays into language and sacred music and poetry. There's a word of the week, a sort of linguistic jeu d'esprit. There's a hymn of the week, a film recommendation of the week, and a poem of the week. Now, for paid subscribers, we'll actually get podcasts too, and audios of my reading the poem, or my discussing what's going on in the poem. And this is all sort of designed to return people to a part of their culture that used to be important. It seems to have faded from people's consciousness. Now, certainly these things are no longer taught in school, but also to have a good deal of fun with it too. We just launched on the 4th of July with the word of the week, liberty.
Nice.
And people can access it, see what's going on there at anthonyesolen.substack.com, I believe.
Great. And
so check it out. Check it out.
And is this kind of an outgrowth of your regular Facebook posts about different words? Was the idea sort of give a different home for those musings?
Yeah. I had done about, I don't know, more than 200 words of the day. And I've gathered them all up. But also I've noticed that people really enjoy film recommendations, and I've been studying sacred hymns for several years now. I've even wrote a book about it, Real Music, reclaiming the timeless hymns of the church. People are naturally attracted to these things that nobody's ever really taught them how to appreciate or even introduce them to at all. But that, let's put it this way: if you want to hear Esolen actually reciting or performing one of Satan's monologues in hell in Paradise Lost, then you got to go to the Substack.
Yeah. Well, of course, classic movies. You've been on our other podcast, Criteria, a couple of times now to talk about some classic Hollywood movies. We discussed Stagecoach, and then more recently, a couple of comedies by the great writer and director Preston Sturges, which is always fun. And I'm sure that we'll do that again at some point. I think we were going to do the Twilight Zone at some point.
We should do the Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
Remember,
that'd be fun.
They are all either Greek tragedies or Christian comedies. More of the former than the latter in the Twilight Zone.
Well, let's talk about this book again. It's In the Beginning Was the Word, an annotated reading of the Prologue of John, published by Angelico Press. And what strikes me about the Gospel of John, and something that I've always wondered about it. This is my favorite book of the Bible, and particularly, I would say the last chapter is my favorite chapter of the Bible. But the style of John is very, very distinctive. And one question I always had, and I really wasn't you address this question to a certain extent in your preface to the book, with regard to the ideas of like historical textual critics of the Bible. But I wasn't really coming at this from that perspective, but just wondering about the style, because I noticed that his style is so distinctive. And in the Gospel of John, the narrator and Christ, when Christ is speaking, have kind of the same style. And I always wondered why that might be. And so that's one of my main points of interest in reading this book, is when you're getting into the reasons for that, because right. John has this, what I would describe as a very, cyclical style. It's sort of repetitive in a way, but he's sort of permutating the different elements from sentence to sentence. It's also, right. it's repetitive, but he'll also make these sudden jumps from one idea to the next, but then he'll come back to the original idea.
As I've called it braided narrative, or perichoretic narrative, a narrative that is like a dance with motifs introduced and then involved with other motifs, brought back, changed, right? So that key words are repeated again and again, not always in the same way, not with the same emphasis. And that it's really distinctive. It's, I mean, it's almost the kind of narrative you are compelled to try to conceive if you are at the brink of human possibility, attempting to describe the Holy Trinity, attempting to describe mysteries beyond our capacity simply to to just write factual things about, must always return again and again to the wellspring, right, for ever new insights. The peculiar thing about John, as far as I can tell, is that unlike, let's say, Matthew, all right, so Matthew is composing his text in Aramaic, right? You can see that underneath the Greek text, but the Greek text is translated from an Aramaic original, right? Luke is composing directly into Greek, although you can hear in Luke, in the speeches that he quotes, you can hear the Semitic underneath it, right? But he's personally composing directly into Greek. What would the narrative be like if you are composing directly into your second language, right? So you're not doing what Matthew's doing. He's composing in his native tongue, and then he or somebody else fights to translate it into Greek. You are, from the start, composing in the second language, right? Then it seems to me that the style is going to follow, right? There are going to be, if that's what you're doing, you're going naturally to rely upon important words and important motifs and bring them up again and again. In some way, your text will be simpler than it otherwise would be. But in other ways, it would be more suggestive. It would not read so much like a traffic report. It would be more like a poem, which is, I believe, what it is. He's got Aramaic, Hebrew song and poetry in his mind as he is composing directly into a second language, Greek. That's really quite unique among the authors in the New Testament. And I think some of the poetic habits that you've noticed in John, he has picked up from Christ, right? Because Jesus himself, in his preaching, often uses poetic form, okay? It's not John who decided, hey, you know what, I'm going to write a text with a lot of interwoven repetitions. Jesus has already done that. Jesus composes that way, right?
Right.
So much of the Sermon on the Mount is really in poetic form. Judge not that you be not judged. I mean, you can almost see hear the Hebrew verbs there. And people who don't know about Hebrew, it's a very terse language. So, judge not that you be not judged. That you be not judged is like 4 or 5 words in Hebrew. After that, it would just be one word. Okay, it would be one word that would echo the previous word. Judge not. Right. You're just playing around with sound and grammar. In English, it doesn't come across that way. It comes across, you got an active voice and passive voice, bunch of words, bunch of little words in between. But in Hebrew, it's not like that at all. When Jesus says in the Beatitudes, "Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven," that's like a verse from Hebrew poetry. And then with the repetitions, right? Blessed, etc., etc. We can see the same kind of thing going on in the Psalms. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever. Let the house of Israel say his mercy endures forever. Let the house of Aaron say his mercy. Let all who fear the Lord say his mercy endures forever. So Jesus has been doing that. And John has picked up he's not just remembered what Jesus said. He's picked up the habit. Okay.
Yeah, because somebody reading this might think, oh, well, the narrator and this character of Christ, so to speak, are using the same style. That must mean the narrator is, at the very least, reinterpreting things that he heard Christ say in his own style of speaking. But you're saying that it's more likely that John, as the beloved disciple who was on the most intimate terms with Christ, had most fully absorbed his manner of speech.
Yeah, and we can see because we can see
because we see that in John's epistles too.
That's right, and then those two are composed. People who know several languages, try this out. Okay, you try to compose a poem or a poetic text, a prose text that is heavily poetic. You try to do that in your second or third language and see what comes out. That's what he's doing, right? His native tongue is Aramaic, but he's composing directly into Hebrew. And of course he's going to rely upon that's the thing that causes him to rely upon repetition. But it isn't as if he's himself fond of the style, quite apart from Christ. He has picked up the poetic habit from Jesus himself. Because it's all over. Everything that we the Lord's Prayer is a poem.
Right.
It's a Semitic poem. It doesn't appear that way to us because in translating it to English, you have to throw a lot of other words in. But if it's sort of translated back into Aramaic, it's a poem.
And in what way do you find the Hebrew behind John's gospel? I mean, how does a reader detect that beyond just sort of conjecture?
Well, Hebrew poetry works by, as I said, it's an extremely terse language, Hebrew. Okay, so in that verse, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever. That's about 12 or 13 words in English. All it is in the Hebrew is Hodu l'Adonai ki tov, ki le'olam chasdo. Hodu l'Adonai ki tov. Hodu, give thanks, l'Adonai, to the Lord. Ki is just a little word, means that. Ki tov. That good. You don't even say because he is good, for he is good. You don't have to say those. Hodu l'Adonai ki tov. Pause. Ki le'olam chasdo. Now, if you get rid of the little keywords, they don't even really count. It's Hodu, give thanks, l'Adonai, to the Lord, tov, good. le'olam, forever. Chasto, his kindness. Okay? And so when I see something like, in the beginning was the Word, right? I'm thinking, go back to Aramaic. In the beginning, Bereshith. It's the first word of Genesis. It's just one word, Bereshith. In the beginning was the Word. Maybe you put in was, maybe you don't. The word will be just one word, okay? Right? So you get like 3 blocks. In the beginning, it's just one word. Was, perhaps was. The Word, just one word. And the Word was with God. That'll be just 2 words. And the Word was God. Another 2 words. So 2 words with the verb of being. Pause. 2 words. Pause. 2 words. It's, you see that kind of structure in the poetry of the prophets. And then you ask, okay, does it continue for most of the prologue? And yeah, it does. Okay. And that got me thinking, right? He's doing this because he's already heard Jesus do this same thing, right? The Lord's Prayer is preserved for us in Matthew and Luke because the disciples remembered it. They remembered it because it's poetry. Now, they didn't themselves then go on to try to compose poetic texts, but they did remember that, so they preserved what Jesus says, right? And so much of what he says, the Beatitudes, it's certain sayings in the Sermon on the Mount and the Lord's Prayer, those are poems. They're composed poetically, right? Well, the other evangelists, they give those to us, but they don't themselves try to compose poetically. John is the exception here. He's composing poetically.
Wow.
As I say, he's picked up the habit.
Now, there's this whole debate about whether the author of the Apocalypse is the John who wrote the Epistles of John and the Gospel of John. And there's this attempt based on style to determine that with some level of scientific certainty. But you, throughout the book, make an argument that this is impossible. So why is that impossible?
Yeah, it's quite impossible. All you have to do, as I've said many times, right? I wonder sometimes whether biblical scholars have bothered to introduce themselves to scholars of medieval poetry,
right?
Which is often anonymous, so that we have to guess whether we've got one author or 2 authors and so forth, right? Because in general now, for the last 60 or 70 years, the point of view that says that there was like 2 or 3 different poets for certain medieval poems, that's been in full retreat. Okay. The news hasn't gotten round to the biblical scholars yet. You can't do if there were a method, okay, that would work. You could apply it to authors we know, right? And whatever method could separate the Gospel of John from the Apocalypse must also work to show that the author of King Lear, as I've mentioned in the book, I believe I mentioned, the author of King Lear is the same as the author of The Merry Wives of Windsor. One is a slight bourgeois comedy, mostly in prose, with undistinguished poetry when it does appear. And the other is the greatest play ever written, much of it in verse, okay? And they're both written by Shakespeare. We say, well, maybe there were different periods. No, he wrote them within a calendar year of each other, okay?
Wow.
They're like night and day. If we didn't have the name of Shakespeare attached to his plays, we'd assume that they were by 12 or 13 different authors. And how could you, I mean, even taking a guy like Charles Dickens, how can you we didn't know the name on the novel, right? Why would anyone suppose that A Tale of Two Cities, which has almost nothing madcap about it, which is really spare when it comes to characterization, and not much by way of laughter in that book. How could anyone suppose that the author of the Pickwick Papers could be the author of A Tale of Two Cities? Right? But we know they're the same by the same author, so that just doesn't fly. As soon as an author has a different purpose in writing a thing, we suppose that he will use a different style. And with such small sample sizes, too, there really is no way to tell. And of course, such scholars are assuming that there was no such vision, right? I mean, if John is having a vision, then in part, he's simply going to be recording what in fact he saw and what in fact was said to him. Okay.
Yeah.
And that will determine much of the style. Nevertheless, I think that there are all kinds of similarities in the style of the Apocalypse and the Gospel of John, even at that. And I first noticed them when, believe it or not, I was going through the New Testament in a early modern Welsh translation. And that took me a long time. It was really slow going, but when you have to go that slowly, you pick things up. And as I was going through the Apocalypse, I said, holy cow, I'm having the same experience here as I'm reading this slowly that I had when I was reading John. It's not as much of it, but it's a lot of it, the same kind of habit that we've mentioned of bringing back motifs, changing them a little bit, okay, weaving them all together, revisiting, free repetition. So it shows up for me more powerfully here in this language that I do not know well, because I have to go that slowly.
Yeah, it's just interesting when you read John and you get these, like I said, we've been saying it's repetitive, it's cyclical, but also there's these sudden shifts from one idea to another in the midst of that, and you're like, oh, well, he doesn't bother to transition you. It's like sometimes it's these short, simple sentences, and then he says something else, and then he goes back and connects the two, but you also talked about this sort of, I think the word you used was elemental style of composition, where he's using these simple but like highly charged, like fundamental symbols to talk about what he's talking about. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, think about it. When he says, and God forgive us our horrible translations. I've heard this verse translated so badly, I wanted to throw the book through the television set. When John is building up to the great climax, which will be in the Word was made flesh, and he says, but to those who did receive him, he gave power to become children of God, who believed in his name, who were born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And to hear that translated as who were born not by human generation, and there it is. The poetry is gone. The very strong link between blood here and blood everywhere else in the gospel, gone.
Yeah.
And that elemental reality of blood, and with all its suggestiveness, right? Its suggestiveness of life, but also sacrifice, okay? Its suggestiveness of continuing, that is, procreation, which is now a new thing. It's not just being procreated in blood, but being made a new creation. So here John is speaking the same language as St. Paul. If you are in Christ, you are a new creation. We're born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. And the Word was made flesh. Oh, cow. So it's right through that whole prologue. Light, darkness, right? Name, blood, flesh, the world, the mysterious word world. He came into the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. And then the surprise, but as many as did receive him, he gave power to become children of God. We're born, right? He knows. If let us suppose that we are correct in assuming that John is writing after the other Gospels have been written, he knows that each one of those other Gospel writers in his own way has gone back to the very beginning of Genesis. Okay? John goes back behind the beginning of Genesis, to the very being, the very person of God. But he's still thinking about Genesis. And he's thinking about the birth of Jesus that he's not going to describe, because we're the ones who are being born, but we're not born of blood, or the will of the flesh, or the will of a man, say Adam, but of God. And then, boom, the word, the sentence that shatters the world. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, at which we should genuflect. And we beheld his glory, thinking of the resurrection and the transfiguration. Glory is of the only begotten Son of God, full of life, light, and truth, right? Life, glory. I mean, and these words then will be visited again all throughout the rest of the gospel. Okay.
Well, part of the divine sublimity of this gospel seems to be that it is using these simple terms and these primal terms and sometimes short sentences, blunt sentences that even a child can understand easily, right. And yet it is the most metaphysically lofty of the Gospels, right. and he has the most to the point where people are trying to explain it by appealing to Neoplatonism, and so that itself is almost a sign of its divine, its divine source, because you don't give a child Plotinus's Enneads right. to read, right? But this has this, like you say, this elemental, this simple, almost primitive force to it. But the way that the elements are combined is so powerful, and it also strikes the heart in a way, even though it's so often describing immaterial realities.
Right. Light.
Yeah.
Right. Well, again, he's picked up the habit from Jesus, who said, "You are the light of the world," to the apostles. Men do not light a candle, light a lamp, and then put it under a bushel basket. They set it on lampstands so it lightens everyone who's in the house. Wonderful parable, but light of the world, that's a powerful thing to say. And John is always thinking about light. He will even say, we all know the sentence from the first letter of John, God is love. He says also in the first letter, God is light, right? And all that would be in Aramaic or in classical Hebrew would be two words. It would be Elohim, the Lord, God. It would be the unutterable name of God. Okay, so you don't say that name, but and name is an important motif also in the Gospel of John, right from the very prologue, right? There'd be the name of God, and then just the word, light. So it'd be Elohim, or that's it, right? That's all. Boom. God, light. English doesn't work that way. It's an amazing thing. So, and of course, he's thinking about the primal creation. Let there be light, said God, and there was light. He's aware too, I think, that in the Hebrew Genesis there, the let there be and there was, they are plays upon the name of God, right? The unutterable name of God, which has to do with being. And God said, Yehi or. Yehi or. God said, be light, and the verb actually is the same form, be light. That's it. Like that. Yeah, and darkness too, right? There's no John does not paint with subtle grays and dark green and brown and all that. He paints in stark contrasts. Jesus did too, and it's another habit he picked up from Jesus.
Now, can you talk a bit about this prologue as a whole and its significance? Obviously, not just as a piece of literature that we read, but in its liturgical significance as well.
Yeah, well, we used to hear it. It was called the last gospel because you would hear it at the end of Mass after the dismissal. And a very powerful thing to hear at that point. And it might cause you to stay a little while and pray, having heard these words, right? And everybody, again, would genuflect at the words, and the Word was made flesh, right? It's the prologue is not just a prologue, but it seems to me the climax of the Gospels and their summation, right? Everything that Christ is eternally, and that Jesus was in his ministry and his passion, his death and resurrection, it's all there in that prologue, right? The prologue that means to be a second Genesis, and the final word too, on beginning and ending. You can't really go beyond this, or God has not revealed anything to us that is beyond this. I don't know what could be beyond this, but I don't know what could be beyond in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? And I don't know what could be beyond in significance in human history, the history of the physical universe, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. So it was, I think it was the perfect way to end a Mass, a solemn and yet joyful way to end the Mass, bringing us always back to the heart of our Christian faith, the two great mysteries of the Christian faith, the Trinity, which is suggested, right, or more than suggested in the prologue, and the incarnation of the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God. And for it to be ignored seemed strange to me. The Pope Paul simply wrote, the last gospel is to be suppressed. He didn't. in the liturgical instructions, he did not explain why. What was his thinking?
Okay.
I don't know. It's too bad, though. I think I've suggested maybe people should try. Maybe even priests might, on their own, right? Not holding people there, but on their own, saying, "Well, at the end of Mass, though, we're going to reintroduce the last gospel. You don't have to stay around if you don't want to, but that's what we're going to do." It's our faith. It's the whole of it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you could do that after a solemn Mass, at least, for instance.
Yeah.
Now, this word logos, which we have translated as word.
Right.
I'm told that this word logos can mean many, many, many other things. It can mean reason, for instance. Why did it end up being translated into English as word? Did the Greek readers of this, were they thinking something like word when they read it, or were they just thinking of that entire complex of meanings? How limiting is it to say word?
It's the Greek readers might have been thinking about some of those other things. Certainly, when Saint Augustine read the Neoplatonists, he believed that they were on some kind of similar track, because he said you can find in the works of the Neoplatonists, not expressed in the same way, but you can find the same meaning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's there in a shadowy way. But you won't hear in them, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, right?
Right.
Still, though, I mean, it's translated in English word because that's the nearest translation we have, and Jerome translated it into Latin. It was translated as verbum, meaning word.
Right.
But I like to emphasize the verbal quality of what it would have been in the Aramaic, or the classical Hebrew. Devar in classical Hebrew word has a strong verbal quality to it, the quality of action. It's not something that just stands there in pristine untouchability, a merely intellectual thing, a concept, or an intellectual power like rationality.
Right.
In the Hebrew understanding, it is a speaking, right? And a speaking implies a speaker and someone to whom the speaking is spoken. So, for instance, in the Hebrew understanding, right, what we call the 10 Commandments are known by Hebrews as the 10 words. Okay. The Word of God is the speaking of God, and it has an active and personal force. All right.
Right.
And that's why I resist intellectualizing too much the idea of the Word, right, as something shiningly impersonal, abstract. It's intensely personal in the Hebrew mind because it's a speaking that implies a speaker and someone who hears what is spoken, and the speech itself. And there we almost have the Trinity, right? So in the beginning was a speaking, right? And the speaking was God, and the speaking was with God. The speaking was facing God. The speaking was in front of God, facing him. And the speaking was God.
Right.
They've got the mystery of the union of the Son with the Father, although they are distinct. And it comes across more clearly if we try to go back from the tendency of Greek, which is to abstraction, back to Hebrew, whose tendency is almost never to abstraction, but to the concrete, the
Right.
Things, persons, actions.
Can we find a reference to the Holy Spirit in the prologue?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, not explicitly, I suppose. But it comes later in the first chapter when John says, "I saw the Spirit coming down as a dove from heaven, and he remained upon him." Right. Now that Spirit is the Hebrew ruach, and that too brings us all the way back to Genesis. And the Spirit of God was brooding upon the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw the light that it was good. It's there it is, right? And it's John seems to understand that action is reminiscent of the very beginning of all things, right? When the sacred author of Genesis says, mysterious way, and the Spirit of God was moving, rather with the action of a bird brooding upon a nest, was moving upon the waters. God said, "Let there be light." Well, in this time it's in the form of a dove, right? This is the vision that God has granted to the people who saw the baptism of Christ to John, in the form of a dove. And then we're probably thinking about, or we should be thinking about that other time when there were waters everywhere and it appeared as if all creatures would die. But there was Noah saved in that ark, and he sent the dove out, and the dove came back with the branch of olive to show to Noah that in fact the waters were receding and there would be life again. That seems to be in John's mind. It was certainly in Peter's mind, because he refers to the same idea. The final coming of Christ will be like Noah's flood. That's why we need to get into the ark which is the church. Where did Peter pick up that idea? He picks it up from Jesus, because that's what Jesus said. It will be as in the days of Noah. So, I think it's there, not necessarily explicitly in the prologue, but somewhat later as we get to the man named John. Now, the interesting thing about that, John, I'm fed up. I'm fed up almost to exasperation with bad, stupid translations. A man called John. There was a man called John, right?
Yeah, that's pretty bad.
There was God sent a man called John. Terrible. There was a man sent from God, and the sent is related to the word apostle, right? It's the same Greek word that gives us apostle, sent from God, whose name, and the Hebrew for sent, it was reminiscent of Moses, sent from God, whose name, and the name is a crucial word in Hebrew, right? Hashem, the name. You're not even supposed to utter the name of God, whose name was Yohanan, God, the Lord, right? Whatever we call it, Yah, there, God, or the Lord is gracious, right? Yohanan, grace of God, or God is gracious. So there was a man sent, with an echo of Moses here, from God, whose name was God is gracious. That puts a different light on things, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
We're not just going to mention John because that's what the name happened to be. And there's also mystery in that too, right? Why did Zechariah name his son John? Nobody understands it. Nobody understands it. Nobody in your family had that name. And it's not a particularly propitious name in the Old Testament. Why that name? In the plan of God, it was to be that name because of what the name means.
Right. Well, so yeah, we have this prologue that is expressing the most basic metaphysical, theological, dogmatic realities, and then he brings John the Baptist into it.
Right.
And it's interesting that, this is the Gospel of John, and then we have another John right at the beginning, and he never tells us, my name's John too. What's going on with there? That's surely not a coincidence either.
He doesn't want to put himself forward, but he does put that name forward right at the beginning. He is instead calling himself throughout the disciple whom Jesus loved.
Right.
And that's almost inexpressibly tender, full of gratitude, feeling.
Right. But what would you say is the link between John the Baptist and John the Evangelist in this right here at the beginning of the Gospel of John? Obviously, it's functioning because with the introduction of John is the beginning of the story. We've got he's laid out what was before all time, and now there was a man sent by God whose name was John, and that's the beginning of the story. But there seems to be some connection between these two Johns as well.
Yeah. Well, let's put it this way. The first John, God is gracious, heralds a new Genesis. He's the herald of a new creation, right? His function is always and only to point the way to Jesus, to point the way to that man there whose name means God saves.
Yeah.
Right. The meaning of whose person is expressed in the name Emmanuel, God shall be among us. God will be among us. God with us. Right. Mm-hmm. So that John is heralding this new creation, and otherwise he has no function at all. Okay. He is entirely given to Christ. He must increase and I must decrease.
Right.
In the second John is granted this vision of the apocalypse, beyond which there is no possibility of going. It's the consummation of everything.
Right.
And in the prologue to his gospel, he has gone behind even the creation of the entire world. Right? There's no place to go further back than that. And for us, as what has been revealed to us, as far as what has been revealed to us concerned, there's no way going beyond where he's gone at the end of the apocalypse. All he can say is, little children, what we will be has not yet been revealed to us, right? But we will be like him, and we will see him as he is, right? Beyond this, you can't go, because beyond this has not been revealed to us. Beyond it, it has not been revealed to us by God. Before it, so to speak, you can't go, because how can you go before the very being of God? So they're in the gospel there. You've got the ultimate beginning, at the end of the apocalypse, the end beyond which nothing has yet been revealed to us, the peace of God that passeth understanding. And at the fulcrum of it all is this John the Baptizer, John the Drowner, who is all and only a herald of a new creation. John the Drowner, perhaps we should call him.
Yeah, John, of course, the greatest of the prophets, and John the Evangelist, the most lofty of the evangelists, the person who puts the capstone on Scripture with the Book of Revelations, the Apocalypse.
Right.
It's just interesting to see the two. John the Baptist as the capstone of the Old Testament, and John the Evangelist as the capstone of the New Testament. And in
the providence of God, the two boys were given the same name.
Right, and he starts his gospel. Starts the story of his gospel. He gives us what was there for all time, beyond time, and then he immediately starts with John the Baptizer.
That's right.
And so it's interesting to ponder that.
And the waters.
Right. Yeah.
And the summoning of the first apostles.
Yeah.
You know what? I wish that biblical scholars would cross the courtyard and talk to literary scholars, if there are any left who haven't gone over to race, class, gender ideologies. But those literary scholars among us who still actually know poetry, especially poetry in other languages or poetry from before the modern period. And, that might be mutually fruitful. I think they'd learn a lot, and not, I think, blunder into errors that old-fashioned literary scholars might have warned them against. Old-fashioned literary scholars from, say, 1950, 1960, even 1970, who no longer had a prejudice against the Middle Ages, and who saw that these medieval poets, these pre-modern poets, were doing all kinds of things that modern poets do not do, and therefore many of the assumptions that previous critics had about their poetry, or even their identity, were in fact flat wrong. If only those two groups of people had talked to each other, then maybe we wouldn't have to put up with the wildly speculative and baseless, and sometimes easily disproved statements about the Gospels. Guys, talk to each other.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Yeah, and that's what you're trying to bring to this commentary, not as a scripture scholar per se, but as a scholar of literature.
Right, especially a scholar of poetry, and I can stumble about in Hebrew, and I know the Greek, and I myself write poetry, and I'm steeped in pre-modern poetry in a wide variety of languages. And so I think that has allowed me to see things in the text that your annotators of the New American Bible don't see.
Yeah, thank you for writing this. I really enjoyed it, and thanks for coming on the show once again. This was fun.
Well, thanks. And next time we'll have to do one on poetry.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, well, we want to talk about Pearl eventually.
Oh, that's
I
true.
think that'll
We want to
be-
talk about
yeah,
Pearl.
we talked about that. So again, people, the book is In the Beginning Was the Word, an annotated reading of the Prologue of John, and the new Substack is anthonyesolen.substack.com.
And it's Word and Song. Called
Word and Song, that's right. And thank you, everybody, for listening, and I will see you next time.